I am NetMoverSitan, and I want to go over the Bloodfiends, a unique kind of being. Well, I best start. Okay, this will need some heavy speculation, largely due to how little is known about the history of the Project Moon universe, at least before the Smoke War, but I'll see what I can come up with in this. Now, where to begin? Yes. What is a Bloodfiend? Now let's start by saying what a Bloodfiend isn't. They are not abnormalities, as they're capable of being killed. Most are distortions, but are similar to them. However, a few Bloodfiends are distortions, made by the White Knights and Dark Days. One notable example is Elena, the Blood Red Knight, but they're considered rogue elements by the more natural Bloodfiends. As for the origin of the Bloodfiends, and Bloodfiends are considered unique compared to abnormalities and distortions, or even Pecatula. The first ones were made by what Moses described as the primogenitor. Now, it's unclear who or what this primogenitor is, although it's hinted at being the abnormality Nosferatu, as it's implied as that one by Larier, the elder of District 12, that they received blood in a certain mansion. A huge building was in the background of the arena that the librarians on the floor of language fought this abnormality. And he certainly has abilities that resemble what a Bloodfiend can do. Now, whether the primogenitor is Nosferatu or something different, he made at least 26 Bloodfiends, the first kindreds. The first Bloodfiends to be made. But while the primogenitor is capable of making as many kindreds as they like, from first kindred onwards they can only make 2 kindreds maximum. Now, it's unclear if one kindred dies, a replacement can be made, where they can only have 2 kindreds at any one time, or if they can only make 2 kindreds and no more. It's more likely the former, as it's likely that those that used to be humans could only make a limited amount of connections with others. Now, I don't know how Project Moon could get away with that legally. What do you mean? You'd probably be asking? Well, I'll tell you. As it draws some inspiration from Vampire the Masquerade, certainly with the term kindred to describe those within a familiar group. Clans in Vampire the Masquerade, families in the Project Moon universe. It even extends to having a primogenitor, and the fact that the earlier the generation, the more powerful they are. Now, in Vampire the Masquerade, an older generation vampire is immune to mental powers from a younger generation vampire. In the Project Moon universe, there's a psychological barrier that prevents younger generation kindreds from going against older generation kindreds, which is why the cursed helm of Mambrino was needed to overcome this, as in making first kindred Don Quixote wear it, allowing the younger generations to turn against him. There are also differences with what they're weak to. Vampires are vulnerable to sunlight and burn when exposed to it, while Bloodfiends are UV tolerant and show no ill effects when exposed to it, They do, however, have a psychological weakness to exposure to water, similar to how Martian Manhunter has pyrophobia. The main difference is that fire causes damage when exposed to it, while water just psychologically incapacitates. Although some can overcome or at least resist their psychological vulnerability to water. They also organise a society hidden from the human population of the city. Now, in the case of Vampire the Masquerade, they're divided into clans. As for the Bloodfiends, before Chapter 7, there was 26 elders or first kindreds, one for each district of the city, where each is likely to have different ways of doing things. In District 16, First Elder Don Quixote tried to create peaceful coexistence by tearing down his castle and creating an amusement park where blood can be paid to them voluntarily in exchange for goods and services. And he thought that hemo bars, which sounds like a form of black pudding, coagulated blood served as part of a cooked breakfast in England, would sustain his family, which ended badly, where his family only has one survivor. In District 12, First Kindred Laudière had a more successful business model. She ran a hotel where the guests paid in an, as in the typical legal tender of the city. Then, while they slept, she had a non-lethal amount of blood taken from the guests, and then removed all memory of this to avoid the attention of Bloodfiend hunters. I'll get to them later. As for blood, both use blood for a number of abilities. While vampires need to feed in order to survive, along with heal and use a number of disciplines, Bloodfiends don't seem to need to feed in order to survive, but it does weaken them and cause them to lose their minds over time, which happened in La Mancha Land, as the hemo bars didn't provide enough blood to stave off the insanity. It even resulted in First Kindred Don Quixote being staked by those that he was trapped within the Manchaland, due to the helm of Mambrino. They're also only as strong as the amount of blood that they have. Those that are weakened due to the lack of blood, such as those trapped within the Manchaland for 200 years, were more vulnerable. But those that have been fed more recently are much stronger. Sancho had been feeding, and Dante's 11 was barely able to take care of her. Don Quixote, the first kindred, was able to overpower all but Sancho, and this was him when he hadn't fed on blood for some time. Ooh, imagine what he'd be like at full strength. They'd be. There have been those who have gorged on blood to such an extent that they became multi-armed giants, such as during the Bloodfiend War, when humans and Bloodfiends fought each other. As for when the Primogenitor made the first Bloodfiends, it's unclear, but it appears to be sometime before the machine purge that Cariambra mentioned. Sometime after that, the Bloodfiend War happened, and after the Manchegan family sided with humans, they became pariahs to the others of their kind. Now, we've already covered the Manchaland. First Kindred Don Quixote was able to make Rocinante, where it can appear as a red blood construct in the shape of a horse, and can also appear as a pair of running shoes that Sancho, as Don Quixote, wore, which suppressed her bloodthirst and hid all Bloodfiend external traits, which allowed her to pass for human. Yes. Rocinante allows her to pass for human, and although Rocinante has a mind of his own, the Bloodfiends didn't go without opposition, as there are fixers that specialize in hunting Bloodfiends, often deriving sadistic pleasure out of it. These Bloodfiend hunters, they use water to incapacitate the weaker members of the Bloodfiend race. They wield other weapons that have Bloodfiends in mind. In the case of the Fang Hunt office, a fixer office that hunts Bloodfiends, they use large mallets with spikes. Now think a giant meat tenderizer and you'll get the idea of what they have. They might also have drugs that deal with bleeding to make it harder for them to bleed out, to not allow access to their blood, allowing the Bloodfiends to drain it easier. As for potential countermeasures, besides water and drugs that make it harder for the aspiring Bloodfiend hunter to bleed, there is the possibility of spraying acid or using a flamer, something capable of damaging the Bloodfiends quicker than they can regenerate damage. And they can certainly regenerate damage. How effective that healing factor is depends on how early degeneration is and how much blood they've consumed, although they'd need to watch out where they use them, as damaging a residential area within a district will result in taboo hunters coming for them in any district. There's also the possibility that it doesn't matter if they're human or Bloodfiend. Once the head is off, as in they're decapitated, it's all over. Then there's also the possibility of powerful EGO being used against them, such as what Zhao had on her. She would likely be able to turn them all to ashes. Then there's Virgilius, the Red Gaze. His allows him to control blood, as long as it hasn't dried up. So far, he's demonstrated being able to hide in pools of blood that haven't dried up, the ability to form blood-based constructs such as swords and even spears, the latter he used against the Wild Hunt in District 20, raining down blood spears like he was trying to reenact the Battle of Thermopylae, or however you pronounce it, as the role of the Persian archers. He can also make blood spikes appear, as if he was Vlad the Impaler. Yeah, Vlad the Impaler, one known for impaling his enemies. Now, the full limits of his EGO isn't known, but it could give him enough control over blood to counteract their healing factor, certainly with the younger generations of Bloodfiends. A first kindred at full strength would likely be a challenge, even for him. The only thing preventing him from putting that to the test is his contracts. He overstepped his boundaries in District 20. Upper management of Limbus Company is unlikely to be as forgiving towards this kind of breach of the terms of his contract next time. Now, it's unclear exactly how the incident at Hotel Larier was concluded, but we know for certain that Moses, Ezra, and Vesper Crabro got out of it and lived long enough to be recruited by Limbus Company in its distortion specialist division. Well, we might find out how that ends eventually, as the distortion detective was set around the time that the library was an urban legend level threat. Lastly, there's the idea of reproduction. While in Vampire the Masquerade, a vampire's internal organs become practically useless, including reproductive organs, and so pleasure of that kind isn't experienced as humans would feel it. Bloodfiends are likely just as sterile for different reasons. That, and if they try to reproduce like humans did, they'd more likely result in the one that they did that with, if they did it unprotected, turning into a blood bag, as the blood fiend disease that makes their kind, in that context, is likely to be an STD worse than any that we know of. One that makes the one that has it worse than dead, a slave to the will of the blood fiends, where they'll likely be as they are until someone successfully kills them. Now, the time this process takes depends on how young the generation is. It can be quicker with the older generations, but if the blood fiend chooses, they can set it to be delayed, allowing them to be in a populated area to consume their blood. Now, blood bags, they're on the lowest rung of the ladder. They're those that fail to become kindred, or if a kindred has already made their two, well, whichever the case, they're enthralled and only serve as a reserve for blood for the blood fiends. There are also rules within Bloodfiend society. They can only make kindreds with permission from their elders, and going against the blood flow, such as attacking a kindred of an older generation or attempting to turn a blood fiend of an older generation into a blood fiend, which is pointless as they're already a much superior blood fiend, that's called filial impiety. Yes, filial impiety is one of the worst things that a blood fiend can do, and ignorance is no excuse, and in the case of Cassetti, it led to him being melted into a pile of goo. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if the family in District 23 would be able to blend in better, as the backstreets of that district consider cannibalism to be completely normal. I mean, they'd be able to get human blood there without anyone batting an eyelid. It'd be like getting a carton of milk for them. Hunting would likely be more for sport there, although they'd need to watch out for who they target, as I'd expect that bloodfiend hunters there would target them not for being bloodfiends, but because they hunted and killed the wrong target, such as someone from a nest. If it was someone from the backstreets, that's not an issue for them. Considering that cannibalism is so common in District 23, that Hannibal Lecter and Leatherface would probably be, well, they'd probably be food critics there. Well, I think that's all that can be covered about Bloodfiends for now. Until next time. Hail the rabbit!